December 1936. London. The newspaper boys are on every corner. The headlines are the same on every front page. The king is abdicating. On the evening of December 11th, King Edward VIII sat before a BBC microphone and spoke to the British Empire, and through the radio, to the world. He said that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The woman he loved was not in the room. She was in the south of France, in a villa in Cannes, listening to the speech on the radio, surrounded by people she barely knew, in a country that was not her home. The reaction in Britain was not what the fairy tale version of this story suggests. Many people were not moved. Many people were furious. The Church of England had made its position clear. The Prime Minister had made his position clear. The newspapers, most of them, had made their position clear. And Wallis Simpson, the American woman at the center of this constitutional crisis, was the focus of a hatred so concentrated and so public that it is difficult, reading it now, not to feel something on her behalf. She was called a schemer, a seductress, a gold digger, a Nazi sympathizer. Some newspapers questioned her femininity directly, publishing speculation, without evidence, about her biological sex. She was 39 years old. She had been married twice before. She had grown up without money. She had spent her adult life learning how to navigate rooms where she did not quite belong. And now the entire world had an opinion about her, and almost none of those opinions had anything to do with who she actually was. In the villa in Cannes, she heard the speech end. She heard the silence after it. She later said, in her memoir, that what she felt in that moment was not triumph. It was not even love, exactly. It was something closer to dread. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a small resort community, but she grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore in the 1890s was a city with its own social hierarchy, one of the most rigid in America, built on old family names and careful distinctions between those who belonged and those who were merely adjacent to belonging. The Warfields were an old Baltimore family, respectable, connected, moderately comfortable. But Wallace's father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, died of tuberculosis 5 months after her birth. He was 26 years old. She grew up without him. She grew up without much money. She grew up understanding, very early, that a woman in her position had to be more interesting, more witty, more composed than everyone else in the room, because she could not rely on the things other women relied on. She attended the Oldfield School, one of Baltimore's most exclusive girls' schools, on a scholarship provided by her uncle. The scholarship was both a gift and a reminder. She was there on someone else's generosity. She never forgot it. She made her debut in 1914. She was 17 years old. She was, by all accounts of those who knew her then, already extraordinary in the way she occupied a room. Not through beauty alone, though she was striking, but through intelligence and wit, and an instinct for making whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person present. This was not charm in the passive sense. It was a skill, a learned, practiced, necessary skill. Her first marriage was to Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a United States Navy aviator, whom she married in 1916. She was 19 years old. She believed she was in love. Spencer was handsome, daring, and deeply alcoholic. The marriage was, from almost the beginning, a series of humiliations: his drinking, his rages, his extended disappearances, the particular misery of being the wife of a man who was charming to everyone else and cruel at home. They separated. She spent a period in China, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Peking, in the particular floating world of the European expatriate in Asia in the 1920s. What happened to her there, she never fully disclosed. There were rumors about relationships, about experiences, that followed her for the rest of her life and that she neither confirmed nor denied. She divorced Spencer in 1927 and married Ernest Aldrich Simpson in 1928, an Anglo-American shipping executive who was steady, intelligent, and thoroughly decent. Ernest Simpson was not a romantic figure. He was something more useful, a reliable man who gave her stability, a London base, and entry into the upper reaches of British society. They settled in London. Wallis applied herself to the social world with the same disciplined energy she applied to everything. She learned which fork. She learned which tailor. She learned the particular codes of the English upper class, a system more complex and more unforgiving than anything Baltimore had prepared her for. She learned all of it. And then she was introduced to the Prince of Wales. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known to his family as David, known to the world as the Prince of Wales, was, in the early 1930s, the most famous young man in the Western world. He was handsome. He was charming. He toured the empire and was greeted by crowds that behaved more like modern pop star audiences than subjects of a constitutional monarchy. He wore his uniform beautifully. He danced well. He laughed easily. And he was, beneath all of this performance, profoundly and chronically unhappy, a man who had been trained from birth for a role he found suffocating, who had never been allowed to be any particular version of himself that was not dictated by the institution he embodied. Wallis met Edward in 1931 through a mutual acquaintance. She met him again in 1932. By 1934, he was in love with her, or in something that functioned for him as love. Whether she was in love with him is a question that has occupied biographers for 90 years without resolution. What is certain is that she understood him, the real person underneath the prince, in a way that almost no one else in his life did. She spoke to him directly. She did not defer automatically. She made him laugh. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who managed him, this was intoxicating. She was, by this point, a woman who had learned through necessity every skill that could not be inherited. She had no title. She had no fortune of her own. She had no family connection to power. What she had was a mind that worked faster than most, a wit that was sometimes cruel but always honest, and the ability to give a man her complete attention, which is, in certain situations, the most dangerous gift one person can give another. By 1935, the relationship was an open secret in the circles that mattered, and a closely guarded secret everywhere else. The British press, operating under a gentleman's agreement with the palace, had not reported it. The American press had no such agreement. In January 1936, King George V died. Edward became King Edward VIII. He was 41 years old. He had waited his entire adult life for this moment, and now that it had arrived, the question that everyone around him was too careful to ask directly was what he intended to do about Wallis. Edward VIII reigned for 326 days. In that time, he attended to his official duties with varying degrees of engagement, sometimes impressively, sometimes in ways that alarmed his advisors. He spoke to politicians. He reviewed state papers. He attended ceremonies. And he spent as much time as possible with Wallis. In the summer of 1936, they took a yacht cruise through the Mediterranean together, a trip that was photographed extensively by foreign press and reported everywhere outside Britain. The British public, still protected by the newspaper silence, remained largely unaware. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had a private meeting with the king in October 1936. He told Edward, plainly, that the government could not support a marriage to Wallis Simpson. She was an American. She had 2 living ex-husbands. The Church of England, of which the king was titular head, did not recognize divorce. It was constitutionally and socially impossible. Wallis had filed for divorce from Ernest Simpson in October 1936. The divorce was granted. The machinery was in motion. On December 1, 1936, the Bishop of Bradford gave a speech that was interpreted, possibly correctly, as a veiled reference to the king's personal life. The dam broke. The British press, freed from its self-imposed silence, published everything at once. In 48 hours, the story went from a secret known only to the establishment to the most discussed topic in the world. Wallis was in the south of France by this point, having left England at Edward's insistence to allow tensions to cool. She was receiving telephone calls from Edward multiple times a day. She was reading the newspapers. She was watching, from a distance of several hundred miles, as a crisis she had not chosen spun entirely beyond her control. She wrote to Edward. She urged him not to abdicate. She offered to withdraw from the relationship entirely, to disappear, to give up everything if it would allow him to keep his throne. He refused to hear it. Edward had made his decision. He was going to abdicate. He was going to marry Wallis. He was going to live the life he had chosen rather than the life that had been chosen for him. It was, in its way, the first genuinely autonomous decision he had ever made. The problem, which neither of them fully understood yet, was what that decision would cost her. On December 10th, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. He signed it in the presence of his 3 brothers. The following evening, he made the broadcast. He was no longer king. He was now His Royal Highness the Prince Edward, or, as he would soon be styled, the Duke of Windsor. His younger brother George, who had never prepared, never expected, never wanted to be king, became George VI. His daughter, then 10 years old, was now heir to the throne. Her name was Elizabeth. Edward left England immediately after the broadcast. He crossed the Channel. He went to Austria. He waited for Wallis's divorce to be finalized. They married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cande in France. It was a small ceremony. None of the royal family attended. No representative of the British Crown was present. The Church of England refused to provide a clergyman. A Church of Scotland minister conducted the service. Wallis wore a dress by the American designer Mainbacher, a pale blue that became known as Wallis blue. She looked composed. She looked elegant. She looked like a woman who had won something. What she had actually won was the right to be called the Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness. The royal family, on the specific insistence of the new Queen Mother, who blamed Wallis entirely for the abdication, refused to grant Wallis the HRH style that would have been automatically conferred on any other woman who married a prince. It was a calculated cruelty. Small enough to be deniable. Significant enough to be felt every single day for the rest of her life. 2 months after the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Germany. They met Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. They toured Nazi facilities. The Duke was photographed giving what appeared to be a Nazi salute. The visit was a catastrophe for their reputation, both at the time and in historical memory. The Duke had been warned not to go. The British government had advised against it. He went anyway. Whether he was naive, pro-German, or something worse has been debated ever since. What is not debatable is that the photographs handed a propaganda victory to the Nazi regime and confirmed every worst suspicion about both of them. When World War II began, the Duke of Windsor was posted to the Bahamas as governor, a position that was significant enough to seem meaningful and remote enough to keep him far from anything that mattered. It was, in essence, a continuation of the exile that had begun with the abdication, gilded, comfortable, and completely powerless. Wallis threw herself into the role. She renovated Government House. She organized social events. She did what she had always done, made herself indispensable, made herself visible, made herself into exactly what the situation required. She was also, by this point, beginning to understand something that would take her many more years to fully accept. The life they were living was not a temporary inconvenience. It was permanent. Edward attempted, throughout the war, to obtain a meaningful military or diplomatic role. He was refused, repeatedly, by a government and a royal family that did not trust him, not without reason, and did not want him visible on any stage that might remind people of what he had been. After the war, they settled in France, primarily in Paris, with extended stays at the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne, a house provided by the French government. They became, in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the most famous couple in the world who were not actually doing anything. Paris was kind to them. The French, who had a different relationship with the idea of romantic sacrifice, treated them with a warmth that England never offered. They were invited everywhere. They were photographed constantly. Wallis's clothes were discussed in every fashion magazine. Her entertainments were considered the most elegant in the city. She was, by the 1950s, one of the most closely watched women in the world from a fashion perspective. She dressed with a precision that was almost militant, every detail considered, nothing accidental. The clothes were, for Wallis, what they had always been, a form of armor. A way of controlling the one thing that could always be controlled when everything else was uncertain. Edward gave her jewelry. Constantly. Extravagantly. Pieces commissioned from Cartier and Van Cleef, with inscriptions on the backs that were almost desperate in their declaration of feeling. The collection was, and remains, one of the most extraordinary in private hands, a physical record of a man trying to prove, over and over again, that he had been right. Edward, meanwhile, was living the life of a man with no particular reason to be anywhere. He played golf. He attended parties. He tended his garden. He gave occasional interviews. He had given up the most powerful position in the world and replaced it with nothing, because nothing was available to him. Those who knew Wallis well, really knew her, not socially but intimately, described a woman who was, beneath the performance, exhausted. Not by the parties. Not by the travel, but by the weight of being the reason. Every conversation about the abdication came back to her. Every criticism of the Duke was ultimately criticism of her. Every time the world discussed what Edward had given up, what was implied was what she had cost him. She had not asked him to abdicate. She had written letters begging him not to. But the world had its story, the scheming American who stole a king, and the world was not interested in a more complicated version. The relationship with the royal family never truly thawed. There were occasional meetings, the unveiling of a memorial plaque for Queen Mary, a visit to London during a hospitalization, but they were formal, managed, and brief. The HRH that had been denied Wallis was never granted. The Queen Mother, who lived until 2002, never changed her position. In 1972, Edward was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was 77 years old. He had been a heavy smoker his entire life. In May 1972, Queen Elizabeth II visited Paris. She came to the villa in the Bois de Boulogne. She saw her uncle, the man who had abdicated before she was old enough to understand what that meant, for what would be the last time. He died 10 days later, May 28, 1972. His body was flown to England. He lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Wallis came to England for the funeral, her first time back in more than 3 decades. She was received, finally, at Buckingham Palace. She stayed as the Queen's guest. She was 75 years old. She was frail. She was the widow of a man who had given up a throne for her. And standing in the palace that had rejected her for 40 years, she looked, by all accounts, like a woman who was not sure what any of it had been for. She returned to Paris after the funeral. To the villa. To the staff. To the rooms full of photographs and the jewelry boxes full of inscribed pieces and the silence that follows a long marriage when the other person is finally, permanently gone. The years after Edward's death were, by all accounts, very difficult. She declined physically, rapidly. She had arteriosclerosis, which progressively affected her mind. By the late 1970s, she was largely confined to the villa, attended by nurses and staff, visited occasionally by a small circle of friends who found each visit harder than the last. She lost the ability to recognize people she had known for decades. She lost the thread of conversations. She lost, piece by piece, the extraordinary sharpness that had been the most consistent fact of her character. Her lawyer, Maîtresse Susan Blum, a formidable French woman who had managed her affairs for years, became the gatekeeper of the villa. Visitors were discouraged. Friends were turned away. The woman inside became increasingly invisible to everyone except the staff. On April 24, 1986, Wallis Simpson died in the Villa Windsor. She was 89 years old. The cause was listed as arteriosclerosis. She had been, in any meaningful sense, absent from her own life for several years before the end. She was buried at Frogmore, the royal burial ground at Windsor, beside the Duke of Windsor. They lie there together. She had spent 50 years being refused entry to England as anything other than a visitor. She was finally allowed to stay. After Wallis died, her estate was auctioned. The jewelry, the pieces Edward had given her over 50 years of declared devotion, sold for $50 million. The proceeds went to the Institut Pasteur in Paris for AIDS research. The question that biography has never quite settled, the question that Wallis herself, in her memoir and her letters, only partially answered, is whether she was happy. There were clearly years, decades, in which she was, in the way that deeply social and intelligent people can be happy in the presence of others, genuinely content. She had Paris. She had the parties. She had the clothes and the jewelry and the table at the best restaurant. She had a husband who loved her with a consistency and an intensity that very few people ever receive. And she had, underneath all of that, the knowledge, which she could never fully speak aloud, that she had not wanted the abdication, that she had tried to stop it, that the story the world told about her, the scheming seductress who stole a king, was not only cruel but wrong. Edward had chosen her, completely, irrevocably, with a totality that was, depending on how you looked at it, either the greatest proof of love or the greatest burden one person can place on another. He had made her responsible for his happiness. He had made her responsible for his decision. He had made her, in the eyes of the world, responsible for the abdication, when the abdication was his, not hers. The royal family never forgave her. The British establishment never accepted her. The church never blessed her in any meaningful way. And the woman who had grown up without money, without a father, without the security that others took for granted, who had learned, through pure determination, how to navigate every room she was not supposed to be in, ended her life in a villa in Paris, unable to recognize the people who came to see her, attended by hired staff, in a country that was not her own. The golden cage is one of history's most common traps. It comes in different sizes. It is made of different materials. Wallis Simpson's was made of titles and tiaras, and a husband's absolute devotion, and a world's absolute judgment. She maintained the performance. For 50 years after the abdication, the clothes, the composure, the wit, the table settings that were always perfect, the guest lists that were always interesting, the face that gave nothing away, unless you knew where to look, and very few people did. She had once told a friend, in one of the few unguarded moments that made it into the record, that the worst thing in the world was to become famous for something you had not intended. She had not intended the abdication. She had not intended to become the most hated woman in England. She had not intended to spend half her life in exile. She had intended, once, simply to have a good life. She lies now in English soil, which was refused to her living, beside the man who chose her. Over a kingdom, she was a girl from Baltimore, who had no money and no father, and learned everything the hard way, every code, every room, every skill. She did not set out to break a crown. She set out to survive. And in the end, she did. Just not in the way either of them imagined. That is the story of Wallis Simpson.